So I'll get started on this panel. This is video game iconography. So the idea here is that I have a way to approach games that I like to use to think about them, specifically early video games, which I would call in my blanket instance to be kind of pixel era games in which abstraction and approximation is more important in graphics than photorealism. So I have a few things I want to present as ideas to you, the audience, but then it sort of depends on the second half of it. It's just us talking about examples we find interesting and games that are exceptional or not. I should also preface this by saying that in the MAGClassic promotional literature, I am billed as former virtual fools. Back in MagFest 2 in 2003, I started to come to MagFest. It used to be under the auspices of having a website. A friend of mine, Bobby Schweizer, usually presents panels with me. He's not here today because he just started a new job this week, and so he had to take priority with moving to a new city and starting a new job. So we'll miss him, but you'll see him at the next MagFest. But we're both academics. I'm at University of Pittsburgh. We just started 2 weeks ago, so I've been able to settle in a little bit more. And I study film studies. My background's in art history, and I also teach when I can video games, and I've been interested in games for a while. So I like to present at MagFest ways to think about games that are informed by different arts, and to think about the history of ideas also. So we're going to talk a little philosophy and a few other allied and associated ways of thinking about what games mean. But like I said, the bulk of this is let me pitch you an idea of how I read certain games and see if it's credible, and then see if we can come up with more games that it either doesn't or does work for. So this is about, I think that there's a language that we understand in video games after we are familiar with certain genres and with certain platforms that we can glance at a screen and without necessarily knowing anything specific about a game, we can read or decode a lot of what is happening or is intending to happen in that game. We can also, based on our cultural associations with objects that we see, we make judgments about whether or not things are good or bad or desirable or dangerous. We get a sense of what conflict is based on what we think the relationships between objects is without even being necessarily told how a game plays itself. So I wanted to throw two basically random screenshots from games up, which I think most people here would probably know. One is the Atari 2600 version of Pac-Man, the other is the NES version of Final Fantasy. And if we can erase from our mind the fact that I think all of us have played Pac-Man and know Pac-Man, and if all we had are cultural associations, we could look at these images and kind of decode some of what it means. So we would get the sense that you're in a labyrinth. Contextually, we might understand that because there's only one of the icons, that we are not supposed to associate ourselves with the ghosts, because in most cultures, ghosts are things to be avoided or feared or that we are afraid of. We tend to think that I think most of us would assume that the ghosts are bad and are not to be approached. And then I think that we'll also realize that things like that pretzel-looking object are probably good things because we as human beings who eat food have good associations with food. So, I don't necessarily know anything about Pac-Man, but I already know something about what the game assumes I want to read into it. Also, there's numbers at the bottom. Without necessarily knowing what a score is, I can imagine that more numbers are better. A lot of people operate under that assumption. And then, to apply that same way of reading Final Fantasy, we know that this is kind of Crescent Town. It's like the first place you start. It's you're essentially doing the tutorial more or less before you get to cross the bridge into the real world where you start having the job system and everything, or where you start not having the job system, but where you start buying spells and doing other things like that. So at this point, we see an approximation of a castle. We see what appears to be a town nearby. We can probably infer that the blue stuff is water. We can probably infer that the thing that is there is a port or someplace where a ship would go. We also know a lot about scale just by looking at this. We have a person who is as big as one of the gradients of town. So we have to think that this person is important in this game because they're as big as something that is in reality much bigger than they are. So there's certain things we know about it without even really diving into what the game is about. But what I just did is making assumptions about games without really knowing anything about them. And that's kind of what iconography is, the study of the use of iconography in studying what artworks mean. So it's an art historical term, and it's a term that I think we use in a lot of other ways too. And there was a time in Western culture when it was the dominant way to study artworks. And it's a term that started to be used in the 17th century, and it was used to decode medieval art, which already was historically pretty far away from where people were in the 17th century. So basically, it's related to iconology, and if you're interested in the differences, we can talk about those. But iconography is the study of visual imagery and its symbolism and interpretation, the systematic investigation of subject matter as opposed to style. The idea is that if you know the content, you can know a lot about the thing. And if you know what content means in one version of something, chances are you know what it means in another version of something, right? So the idea in our history would be to say, look at a painting of Jesus on the cross. And there are hundreds or thousands of paintings of that. And without even necessarily knowing the exact story of what is being depicted, by knowing what certain aspects of that painting means, it means that you can look at any version of that painting and tell somebody what's going on, what the story is. But it's a mode of analysis that finds symbolic or allegorical meaning. So it's essentially a way to read objects and say, this is what this means in the context of the world I live in. So what you do is you make comparisons between things you've seen. I mean, I think this is the intuitive part. We understand a shared language because we've seen versions of it, and we verified that some of those things mean something and some mean this and that, so that once you understand what an icon is, you can glance at it and kind of know exactly what it is, right? So I think this is my takeaway from it. This is readable at a glance. The fact that we can bring examples of games that none of us have played, and you can put it on screen, and we're going to be able to understand 90% of what is there without even having to really exert effort for it. So the more specific way to describe that is that we know the genre of communication, we understand the assumptions, and we understand what we call the rhetorical register of the game, how the game seems to be addressing us. So yeah.
Two questions.
Yeah.
Do you mind if we interrupt now?
Oh, no. So basically, ask questions as we go. I have some stuff, and then at the end, all questions. Yeah.
What's the difference between iconography or symbolism?
Mm-hmm.
I say this word iconography.
Right.
But can you substitute the word a symbol? This is an icon. This is a symbol.
Right.
Is there a difference between the two?
Right. So I just picked iconography because we could also talk about symbolism, and in much of how I'm using it, you could substitute them. But I picked iconography because it's like a type of it's an approach. So it's essentially it's a discourse, I guess is a better word. It's something that was systematized and taught to people as a way to do something, whereas but what you're doing essentially is looking for symbols, right? So rather than, I think maybe if there was a word symbolology, it could be the word to be substituted. But I'm just using it because it's the historical example. Yeah. Was there another part that you wanted to? Okay. So I'm gonna say the word iconography until it is meaningless to us, right? It's like when you say wood too many times, you're like, what is wood?
Well, now, see, I don't use that word a lot. So now you say it's what I'm doing is it's defining that term for me,
right,
as opposed to a symbol.
Right. And so I think when we kind of start seeing more examples, or when you guys come up with more examples, there are certain instances that we might come up with where an object is literally what it is, and then in some cases where it can only be meaningful if it's symbolic or allegorical in relation to something, right? So I think that, but what I want to quickly get out of the way before kind of drawing a few more specific examples is that these are I think the things that we have to pay attention to when we look at a game this way. So it's contextual. So does anyone know which game this is that I have an image from?
Is that McKids?
Sort of. It's like the McDonald's branded Global Gladiators game that came out on Genesis. I don't know the exact title, but it's basically McDonald's anti-pollution platformer game that is hilarious because it's an anti-industrial game for a company known for industrial farming. It's sort of like it's like them selling a game and saying, look, we can't be all that bad because we have this game with an environmental message. So it's a fascinating game. But the reason I picked that image is I don't think it's a game, if you've played it, you probably played it once years ago. I don't think it's a game anyone holds dear. But we can just quickly look at the image. This is from a stage in which you are in an industrial town. You have essentially like a gun that shoots like glop that purifies the environment. But we can look at this and we can say like, and I wish I had a better image of it, but we understand that you're in a steel and steam and kind of polluted city. So essentially, in order to understand it, we're looking at context. We we think about iconography in terms of, and the reason I want to focus on maybe earlier games is that it's also about abstraction. So these games cannot show you the photorealistic version of everything they want to show you. So because of that, they have to show you a close approximation of that thing that's, as I said, readable at a glance for us. So in this case, they could show us a grosser and grimier and more industrial city, but by just having naked exposed steel beams as the platform, we get what the sort of environment is going for. This is what interests me a lot, and I want to talk more with you guys about whether you think that this is true in a lot of games, but I think iconography, or symbols, to use that word again, code ethical or moral values into a game. So in this case, we see this world, and we infer that this world is not a good place to be in, and that presumably if you're the person in charge of cleaning that world up, then that you are a good person, right? If you can think about a world in which actually pollution is good, and to clean it up would be to be doing an affront to nature, then our sense of the iconography, the values of it would change, right? And that the other thing is iconography and symbolism play to our prior knowledge of communication. We can only understand something as meaning something if we have no other examples, which I said earlier. But then there's other ways in which it functions too. So I have a few case studies, and then it's kind of let's open it up to everything. But does anyone here play Adventure? Okay. So Adventure, I think, historically it's, oh, okay, so you got me. I played it a little bit later than that. So this is a game where, because of the technical limitations in programming it and the size of available resources, the degree of abstraction is extreme. But it also, to an extent, is intuitive, I think. And I say to an extent because it's also a famously hard game insofar as it can be meandering, and the abstraction is so extreme in moments that you have to really think about what you're seeing, especially if you're coming from a game that we would play today back to it. But essentially, your avatar in this game is like the least, it's like the least written upon avatar you can have in a game practically, because you're sort of just a shape. And so on the one hand, because you are the agent of movement in the game, you understand yourself to be that shape. But on the other hand, the game gives you no sense of what values your character inhabits. So this is an example, I think, where it stands for you, and that we all understand that, but then our imagination does the work of what the you is, right? So, I can imagine a situation, because I've done this with early video games, where I would draw what I imagine my character to be myself, because the version of my character in the game cannot possibly live up to that. Whereas if we go to Bayonetta 2, our character is so overdetermined in detail that it would not make sense for me to want to draw my imagined version of what that character does. But anyway, so the other things we could do in terms of reading this symbolically or in terms of iconography is that we kind of infer, we know the key's a key. The dragon, which sort of looks like a duck, is a dragon, and part of how we know this too is that there's boxes and instruction manuals that tell us things that the game itself can't tell us, because the game can't use words, but it also can't contain the level of detail needed to explain it. An example I like to use also when talking about this is Haunted House for Atari 2600, which, if you don't know that it's the genre of a haunted house story, you might think it's a totally different type of game, because the level of detail is so sort of blurred. But then you kind of understand you're in a room, there's walls, et cetera, but a lot of the work that you do about making meaning and creating an adventure story is mental work that you bring from outside. Does that gel with your experience of playing the game?
As a matter of fact, quickly anecdotal, I
Yeah.
had the Atari 2600, a good friend of mine had it also. I played Pong, and so I could understand that the dot represented me, but I had to watch my friend, who was much more of a gamer than I was, play the game, because when I tried it, I couldn't decipher the symbols, like, why is the duck coming after me?
Right. Like, I like ducks. Why would ducks be doing this? Yeah.
So it was, once it was explained to me and I saw how the game was played, then it all makes sense, and in my mind I'm seeing much more than was being represented.
And I like the way you phrase that, because I still prefer to play, even contemporary games, I prefer to play them after I've watched somebody else play them a bit. And it's not just for intelligibility necessarily, but I'm also now, and I'm sure a lot of us here are, if you watch Let's Play videos or anything, fascinated in how other people's play style, because what is intuitive to me and what I might make as a first choice is not necessarily what everyone else is going to make. So so in this case, it's necessary to watch someone just to understand the system itself, whereas in a maybe more contemporary game that might hold your hand differently, what the pleasure of watching someone else might be a bit different. And this is an example. This is specifically from kind of when I was learning games. The system I learned a lot of games on is the Nintendo Entertainment System. But I think this game is a good example of, by using its placement of objects and things in the frame, it teaches us how to kind of go through the world. So this is from the second level of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game, which is the NES port / adaptation of a arcade side-scrolling brawler. So if I knew nothing about this game or the franchise, what I can infer having played through this section is that pizza is something that I want because they go out of their way both to make an icon for it and to actually have a word for what it is, and they do that very little in this game. And I can also infer that because the skateboarder kind of comes down here, in terms of shapes in the frame, because this is on a plane that's above, I can tell that the game designers probably want me to be utilizing the space up there as opposed to the space down there. Sometimes that's funny, when you play a game that's crowded, you look at where objects are placed because they try to discourage you from going certain places. And so I think that's a thing that you kind of read. The fact that this game, if you play in one player, persistently has the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles logo on screen is pretty fascinating because it means that any prior knowledge of Turtles that you have is constantly being reminded that you bring to bear on the way the game is designed and played. So this is a kind of weird example, but the idea here is that iconography, or our understanding of symbols, prompts us how to navigate through a world in a specific way or a preferred way. I mean, we can still not get the pizza, we can still walk on the bottom, but I think that the way that the busyness of the screen happens, it prompts us to want to do that thing. So that's just an example that I kind of came up with. I think the thing that really fascinates me about iconography, though, is that it's the baggage that we bring to it. So in Doom, getting a meta pack is something that you quickly realize you have to do. You get injured, you need to gain life. What you have is a white box with a red cross on it. Now, that's not necessarily a good symbol in all cultural traditions. If you are somebody from the Middle East, it's the symbol of crusading knights who might have sacked where you lived, who would have put their religion on top of you. Now we have, because of that division, we have the American Red Crescent and Red Cross. It's an international organization that fulfills the same function, but the idea is that the Red Crescent can operate and do good in areas where a Red Cross would be a bad thing, right? So what I find fascinating about this is that if you were to localize, and theoretically, if you're to localize Doom for a country that doesn't have positive connotations with Christianity, you might have to change the iconography of the object to convince players intuitively that they want to get that item, right? You know what I mean?
Are you saying that because that internationally, that we're not all interpreting the red X or the red plus sign the same way?
Mm-hmm. Why?
Because someone in the Middle East might recognize that the red plus means
Medical, right? Yeah.
But just have a natural aversion to the cross and St. George.
Right. I'm not saying that. Yeah. So basically, what I'm not trying to do is say that like, if you are this kind of person, you must hate this thing. What I'm saying though is that like, there's a kind of learned cultural tradition of having good associations with certain symbols that I don't think everyone quite has to the same degree. I do think internationally people would recognize the red cross as a medical symbol, but what I think.
It's like background. Right. How about I guess the Confederate battle flag might be.
Right. That's the sort of symbolic thing of the moment that I think you get wildly different interpretations on what it means. People have anything from absolute sort of vitriol for it to finding it to be comforting and part of their heritage, but
in a game, if you were to have the Confederate battle flag as iconography, you immediately recognize, okay, this is taking place in the South.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe baggage associated with it.
Right. So if you were to use it in a game, like, and this is not as specific an historical example because I think this symbol is a symbol we'd see in a lot of different historical periods. But something like the Confederate battle flag, it would be used in a game, I think, primarily to give a player a specific historical moment and say, here's a way you can glance at the screen and know instantly what time period you're in. Right. And so that's another thing that we can talk about is what icons or symbols in games place us instantly besides things like even ones that aren't from the real world. So my next example, and I promise I'm almost done with my part, is what I call mushroom ambiguity. And I wish I had a better slide for Mario Lost Levels. But basically, mushroom ambiguity is the idea that Mushrooms are fascinating to me, and I think this is a real learned behavior because not everybody eats mushrooms. Some mushrooms are dangerous, and because of magic mushrooms, I think cultural connotations with mushrooms are unpredictability and the fact that they can't necessarily be relied upon to do the same thing every time. So I think it's actually fascinating that in Super Mario Brothers, the mushroom is almost emphatically a good thing. Right? It is the thing that enables you to get hit and survive. It's the thing that enables you to do more in the world. But Lost Levels is great because in the iconography of Lost Levels before they did the Super Nintendo Mario, the Lost Levels, whatever, for someone like me who's slightly colorblind, I couldn't tell that the poison mushroom was poison because I couldn't necessarily notice the difference easily enough between the good mushroom and the bad mushroom. So it's fascinating to me that by adding the element of danger to that game, suddenly I distrust the mushroom as a kind of icon and symbol in a way that I had learned to trust it. But I think that because the iconography has changed in the SNES version to have a skull on top of it and to be purple, that I lost that ambiguity, right? So I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's certain times when an icon you'd think would be readable, but actually it's confusing and hard to tell. And we can talk about whether or not that's good game design, bad game design, unintentional. Is it a problem with my eyesight, which could well be the problem that we're talking about? Or, so that's an example of like I don't think there's a hard and fast rule to it, but it makes for an interesting conversation no matter what. And so then this is what I want to end on, and where I want examples and exceptions and all that stuff. So I have a few like kind of general questions and statements, but if you kind of have been following what I've been saying, I think some game genres and whole modes of game playing are built entirely around iconographic assumptions. They're basically built around us being able to intuit quickly from what we see. But there's also probably some genres that don't use iconography this way, that don't rely on prior knowledge yet still are something that we can pick up and play. And I'm wondering like what are those genres and what types of games would fit there. This is the big one for me though. I think iconographic shorthand is less necessary now, and that we don't see it relied upon to the same extent because we have graphical technologies and genres that are more explicitly or nominally realist. That is to say, they can photorealistically show you a specific version of something, and they don't have to rely on the weird abstract whatever it is. And so then my question becomes, well, what kind of iconography is common? I mean, we still have these things, these tropes that we see all the time in video games. What's common? And then also, I haven't talked about sound at all, but I think that there's maybe the aural equivalent to this, where there's certain noises that we associate upon hearing with certain actions or game states. And what would those be? And can any of you do them with your voice? Because I'd love to hear people making a noise. So anyway, who has some experience with these kinds of things or has examples that they want to bring? Because that's kind of, I'm just basically presenting with you like, here's an interesting way to think about a game or certain games. But does this hold? Is this like is this too specific a way to approach games? Because you've noticed I haven't really talked about gameplay. I've talked about visual understanding, but less and less about, the essential mechanics that some people argue actually make a game, right? Is that the systems and the mechanics are the thing that determines it, not necessarily the visuals. But basically, it's open now. So if anyone wants to add anything, or yeah.
I'd like to note on what you just said about how the gameplay may determine it more than the visuals. I feel that the visuals serve more as a reminder of the implications of what you're seeing in your view screen, as opposed to being directly indicative of the gameplay itself. The gameplay, like there was one game at this last MAGFest, I think it was Default Dan, which was intentionally kind of subverting that on purpose. And so you could actually look at that game and have the same assumptions regarding iconography, but yet they'll be entirely subverted simply through designer choice. So gameplay is very important there in terms of how each icon is used in how the viewer interacts with it.
So I like that example. I didn't play that game, but the one I think a lot of us probably have played is that the way Braid works. Because Braid, when you start playing Braid, you make assumptions about the object of what you're doing, the gameplay, but you read certain characters in that game as this is I'm helping this person or I'm doing good by this person. And then without spoiling it, we all know that the mechanics of the game then reveal that the assumptions you've made all along are not true. So I think that I think that the way designers are able to go now is that I think they understand what were the tropes and they can, as you said, deliberately subvert them. And that I think that makes a good experience for us because we're so familiar that we can come in and be like, oh wow, this thing that I thought was always true is not true, you know. But no, that's a good example of one. Do people have other examples of games where like you think you're doing one thing based on what you know, but then you come in and you're like not doing it? That's a very inarticulate thing I just said, but.
Yeah, it's interesting because you talk about, iconography, and it gives you a lot of visual information, a lot of information to know what's going on. Back to the example of adventure, and then later on, I played Doom and Wolfenstein.
Mhm.
And one issue I had with Doom was not being able to recognize the iconography in the game. A lot of it, at least when I first started playing it, was kind of washed into, at least to me, was washed into the background. And by here, I'm using iconography in a broader sense, things like stairs,
Mhm.
where I didn't recognize them as stairs, and that you have to learn or be taught what this particular shape means.
Yeah,
before you-
is that a button? I don't know. You have to go up to it and investigate it because the draw distances are not
Yeah.
great and I think that's a.
In Wolfenstein, which is I would slide along the wall and keep hitting the space bar to
Mhm.
find a door, because you couldn't
Right.
necessarily recognize
And,
it as being.
and the game teaches you that there are so many secrets that basically you want to go up to every frame of wall and see if something's there.
You find one secret room and then you beat the level. It says, congratulations, you found 9% of all
Right,
secrets.
right.
Good job.
No, and that's great too. Oh god, Wolfenstein's a really fascinating example as well because as opposed to Doom also I think the color palette choice means that a lot of the demons like meld into the walls in a weird way, which does create a horrific effect. But in Wolfenstein, it's like here's a bunch of swastikas, and we of course we have this association culture where like they're bad, and I'm an American, and you also learn like I'm an American Jew, and so naturally this is the enemy here. So I think that's Doom is weirder and kind of harder to grasp. And also, I mean, because part of the reason why we still talk about Doom as a great game is that it really was so different in a lot of ways, and it's not necessarily all the ways that we talk about, but like, yeah, in terms of like, what weird textures am I looking at right now, More people, yeah.
I remember when I lasted about 2 hours into Final Fantasy 13.
Mhm.
And I know that the game is blasted for being very nebulous in explaining its own world, and it basically requires you to go into the in-game glossary and learn what a l'Cie is, or a fallacy, or cocoon, or pulse, or words like that. The experience I had that I don't think many people ever bring up is that early in the game, I'm walking down the hallway.
Yeah.
That was also, again, very famous for a feature of Final Fantasy 13. And I came across this chrome metal ball that was like hovering in midair. It looked kind of like the Death Star. It had a little recessed disc in it, and there was a ring that was gyroscopically like spinning around, and it was just hovering in midair. And I looked at that thing, and like, who wants to guess what would, if you came across one of those things, what would you think it is?
A save point.
Some sort of drone or something that wants to kill you, considering the whole semi-high-tech atmosphere of the whole game.
Yeah, I thought it was a landmine.
Okay.
I thought it was going to explode if I got near it. So I avoided like 7 of those that I came across. And then there came a part where there was a rare split in the path, and I could tell from the omnipresent radar map that the way to the right is dead end. So maybe obviously I have to explore that first before going with the main path. And I came right in front of one of those spinning balls, and it said press X to open.
So you learn the function of
You
it.
get a potion.
Right.
Like, these are the treasure chests of this world, and I never, ever would have figured that out on my own.
Until the design choice of making it a dead end and having you have a different relationship to the thing, right?
This is interesting because, in other words, you're not recognizing the iconography. So the question I have is that when it comes to game design, there's certain icons, like the red cross. If you use that, instantly everyone knows what it means. But when you're designing a game, if you try to force the user to learn a new idiom or a new language, for lack of a better word, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Like, for example, when we were playing this game, the fact that you didn't recognize this being a save point and this being treasure, did that make the game more interesting because you're learning something new, or it's like?
It's frustrating, right?
That's because.
I think the problem was there wasn't a way for you to learn, right? There wasn't, you had to just randomly go around and like, so is this a landmine or is this going to be a treasure chest? There's only one way for me to find out. Boom!
Yeah, and it could be the wrong way, yeah.
Right. Whereas during the tutorial level or on a very early level, where if there was a treasure room with gold and stuff in it, and then off the side there's this glowing thing, and the glowing thing is the only thing that you can actually manipulate in the room. Hey, this thing is in a treasure room. Everything else I can't touch except that thing. It's probably going to be treasure.
Mhm.
Yeah, I don't
And
know.
then, from then on in the game, whenever you see it again, it isn't in a treasure room anymore, but you know what it is.
Did you want to follow up, or?
But I have a couple other short stories
Okay.
that I could throw in about like, recent times I feel like I've been deceived by the iconography of the game. Like, I've been playing Mad Max lately, and I'm probably not telling you anything different, that the color red in games is really often attributed to danger.
Mhm.
Like how all your enemies are usually, they're usually like outlined in red, or like in GTA 5, in Team Deathmatch, you are always on the blue team, enemy is always on the red team. And so in Mad Max, I'm in a race, and the race starts, and the road splits into two directions. One road is painted green, one road is painted red. And so I
Go green.
failed the race like 15 times because I kept following the green path, wondering where the hell the finish line is. I was supposed to take the red path.
Okay.
I'm not like, it's like the green path corresponded to, I believe, the personal waypoint I had set to get to the race.
Okay.
So it was like an artifact of my journey to the start point.
And the game's weird system of trying to navigate you back to the place you just were at.
I think so. Like,
Okay.
I don't know if this was a glitch or what, but I've since played more races, and the optimal path is always painted red.
Okay.
And I would not have thought that would be the path I'm supposed to take.
Right. And I think that you're right that that's not necessarily something that we would intuit based on our associations with the color. But then it's also not necessarily something that, it's not like in the Mad Max mythology, there's a meaning of red that we're all supposed to know. Like, because I can imagine an adaptation of another type of franchise where it's like, oh yeah, well, anybody who watched Batman Returns knows that circuses are bad because, like that, whereas, that may not be a massive cultural assumption, but it's like, in the context of Batman Returns, you don't want to have carnival people coming to you and, not something I thought I'd say today. What are other examples or questions people wanted to bring up? You had one just now, yeah.
I wanted to mention regarding Final Fantasy 13, I feel that was also probably really much of a problem with world building specifically, because a lot of designers, especially in the modern context, try to avoid common stereotypes and assumptions regarding what we have in our current society and in various cultures, and instead try to create something wholly unique.
Mhm.
And then you end up with this idiosyncratic, I can't talk today.
Yeah.
This idiosyncratic difference between what we're expecting and what the designers are expecting, because they went well out of their way to write up an entire 800-year history of this world
Mhm.
that doesn't exist and already has all these preconceived notions that you're now forced to learn as a player. And they're either going to have to do A, lengthy exposition, B, throw you in there and hope you figure things out, or C, the whole glossary thing. And often it's a combination of the latter two.
And the fact that glossaries are usually couched in menus, and you can play some games without ever having to look at, that, as opposed to being something that it really forces you to work your way through and systematically read every entry. I wanted to bring up, because in the last kind of exchange, talking about the function of treasure chests, I think it's fascinating then to contrast the way that Final Fantasy VI introduces you to that concept. Because in Final Fantasy VI, you essentially go through the opening sequence in which before you even go to that weird house in Narsh that has all the people explaining all of the game like menus and things to you, you can get a treasure chest. So you can either know about it and do it in the normal course of playing the game, or you can, before you leave the town, go into that house that teaches you what save points look like. It teaches you that there are sometimes potions in pots. It teaches you about treasure chests, teaches you that monsters can be, and it literally has an academy of scholars in the room who are like, we're a university, who basically teach you how to do these things. So I think it's fascinating that that set of assumptions in the, in 93, 94 would have been a smart thing to include in a game, but then by 2009 when FF13 comes out, or whatever year it was, it's like, here's a weird alien kind of worldscape that we think that you'll have fun decoding, but it's also not something we're going to tell you how to work your way through, with the exception of here's a world where there are corridors that you have to follow certain paths pretty much exclusively. But I think it's fascinating because this is the same company with the same brand identity, working even probably with some of the same staff, but what the culture of video games is so different, even within the same genre, 20 years apart. Yeah. Anyone have examples that they want to bring up of types of games that we haven't talked about, or, did you have another follow-up you wanted to do?
It was just a response to what you were just saying.
Okay.
It was mostly that I think it's also because they were assuming that the players already knew what an RPG was and all the things in an RPG, making the same assumptions that they thought the players wouldn't be making back when they did that in Final Fantasy VI.
Right, and when even though there's a more robust culture of that type of RPG in Japan, it's one of only a few that was brought over for the SNES, and so it would feel as though like it's worth explaining to players. And it's also fascinating because that's the period where Square was like, we want to get more people interested in this genre of game. We're going to do Mystic Quest, which is the sort of stripped down version of what this game is, and it's this thing that will, if you enjoy it, you might want our more in-depth kind of weirder games. But so are there examples now? Do you think it's true though that games now, because they're not as they don't have to be abstract, that they don't rely as much on this stuff, or is that just me making up something? I mean, I don't know. That's my observation over, yeah.
Yeah, well, sorry for coming in late, but this is really fascinating, everything I've heard so far, especially this idea of how generation changes, how the game changes. It affects people who already know stuff.
Mm-hmm.
If you play it again. But, so my greatest familiarity is with Professor Layton.
Okay.
And I found that they continue to have those tutorials and instructions, essentially also because they introduce new things each time, magnifying glass to search for things, and they don't leave out. It's almost like they're ready for somebody to jump into the next game without having played the already new games.
Puzzle games, so each puzzle is so unique itself. Like you can jump to any other than just basically if there's no story per se, it's just a bunch of puzzles and what's the
Well,
puzzle
it really is a story. To me, it's more of an RPG. It's like this is incredible mystery novel. It always has a surprise ending at the end. Who's the villain and who can you trust? So it's very, very complex. A lot of searching through the game.
So my question, because I'm not familiar with the Professor Layton games, but in the context of those games, over however many there are, do they try to develop a really unique visual language that is consistent, or do they change their look drastically from game to game? Or
Very, very consistent.
okay,
Very consistent.
consistent art style, like basically you go around towns, it's all in 2D and basically you poke around the town to find like character NCPs and basically when you touch them icons appear like basically when they talk, an icon to talk when you're talking to them, or an icon that's an exclamation point when a puzzle happens or something.
mm-hmm.
So on and so forth.
But as you play them, the visual, I guess, economy of the game, it's something that even if the mechanics change or the type of puzzle specifically is different, like you kind of feel like you know how to interact with people pretty intuitively, and the game is clear about it. Okay. And I also like, I mean, because does it also have a kind of steampunk aesthetic, a kind of, is it 19th century, some technology, but some historical? And I think that seems to be a really prominent thing across a lot of different types of games now is that it combines something that's historically familiar to us with something that's science fictional, that we have to do some of this weird guessing of like, well, you know, should I eat this synthetic food object? Is that better than real food in this game? I don't know, because in my world I want to eat organic food, but I don't know if this food is more nutritious in this game.
Just one observation, talking about icons and symbols and having to learn them. I still find very fascinating. I use Microsoft Word a lot, and the symbol for save is a floppy disk, which my youngest son has never seen.
Yeah.
A floppy disk, but yet he recognizes that as that little square as the symbol for saving things. Where so he's being taught the meaning, but he has no idea what's behind it. That in the dim ages, that's how you save stuff with floppy disks.
Like I love, it's not as, like where you conflate the technology with the type of thing. And now that we have a resurgence of vinyl, it's not as true, but like 5-10 years ago when MP3 was the sort of dominant format for buying albums, it's still common for us to say records. Like, did you hear the new record by so-and-so? And I knew people who have never owned a vinyl record, but for whom that symbol, and you know, in like in a music interface, the symbol of a record would be something they knew naturally, but also like the album they have is 80 minutes, which cannot fit on one vinyl record. And there's all these different technological things that remove the object from the meaning, right? I like the idea though of them trying to come up with an icon for a solid state hard drive to replace the floppy disk, because that's such a nebulous thing. Like most of us wouldn't know what that would look like, right?
And you can also save to the cloud. You can save
Right.
to, you know, so.
And actually, bizarrely, a solid state hard drive, I think, looks a lot like an old photograph in many ways. There's a needle, and there's a spinning circular drive.
Okay, so the cloud one too interests me because I think, like, now that we ubiquitously compute in cloud terms, clouds I think have cultural connotations of not necessarily being the best thing all the time, right? Because so it's funny that I think now I have more positive valences with clouds and the word cloud, and like, you know, companies whose logos have cloud in them than I would have had 10 years ago, when to me it just means like my soccer game got canceled, or I can't get suntan today because it's not sunny outside.
There was a newspaper article I read recently that said like 65% of Americans are afraid of that inclement weather might ruin the data they have saved on their cloud.
Because they don't understand the difference between. Yeah, so there are more stuff people want to talk about? We still have time, yeah.
In terms of the cloud thing, so I've been doing some research on the whole idea of the network cloud, and it was actually Bell Labs and AT&T that they kind of started the cloud metaphor when people didn't understand how a telephone call worked. And if you had call forwarding, you know, how could it be forwarded if somebody was using your phone at that time, like a babysitter?
So there had to be like some outside place where it went to?
Right.
Okay.
So they basically didn't want to explain what was really happening with switching networks and trunk lines and everything else. So they just said, it's just like it's in the cloud. It goes up there and it magically comes down here.
Well, but that has a kind of ecology to it that I think resonates, where, because I think most people understand how moisture goes up into the air and then gets recycled into the world. So I feel like maybe there's still intuition to it, but I love how it is still sort of a confusing thing that, depending on what your relationship to the technology is, you still may think it's just this magical, weird ether, right?
Yeah, and people have this concept, you know, the angels are up there in the cloud, God is in the cloud, so
Yeah.
it's all good, right?
Right.
But actually, about 20 years ago, I and a graduate student did some research on those old icons being selected for computer interfaces. Basically, the result of the paper was you have to have icons that they should be representative, that is, they should look like, you know, what they stand for, and what they look like should be related to what they're supposed to do. But the second thing is that they need to be
I'm fascinated where occasionally I'll, on my phone, look at all of my apps and the color schemes of some of them, especially Google, because it works with a certain set of colors, I can glance at some of them and I'm like, well, it's a Google app, but I don't remember which one it is unless the text is there to prompt me to remember,
And also like iTunes, they keep changing their symbol, which drives me nuts because I lose it on the screen.
Right. And that's weird to me too, because Apple historically has been such a consistently branded, technology company that you'd think they'd want to kind of roll for as long as possible with the things that they're attached to. I don't know, but I'm not an Apple guy, so I can't speak to Apple so much.
I mean, Apple, when they were first developing the GUI interface, had a whole team of people just working on their iPhone.
Mhm.
They spent a lot of time doing that.
Do you think that arguably that led to a lot of their ability to take the popular imagination is just their, in a way that like Microsoft up until Windows 95, I couldn't tell you what Microsoft's sort of brand strategy was, other than most people have Windows, so why don't you use it, like that kind of thing. But yeah, I was thinking just back to the ambiguity thing. I want to talk a little bit more about just because. Like I like the anecdote about the treasure chest. Are there other games that you guys have played where you would have thought that one type of visual thing was one thing, but it ended up being something different? And we also mentioned Braid, and then this game, what was the game called? Dan?
I think
Okay.
that game was basically everything that's bad, like Spice, is good, and everything that's good will kill you.
Okay.
So basically, that game is meant to subvert everything. Basically, so you think your mind, you gotta get rid of old video game conventions in order to play that game. So basically, you gotta jump on the Spice this time in 2000.
Do you know? Have you played it?
I played a bit of it, but
How hard is it to learn to?
it takes some time.
Okay.
Well, I think if you play long enough, you'll be able to adapt to it enough based on trial and error. Like I remember, like in an old Kingdom Hearts game, like there had an empty room. Well, they had a room with the same architect like Traverse Town, but there's 3 icons that are different. Like you got Heartless that's moving around. You got these 2 spheres. Like one's like black hole, but it's supposed to be black hole, and another one's like an orb. Since there's only 3 objects in a room, you have to interact with them no matter what, even though you may not know what it is. So
And they may look dangerous upon first glance. Yeah.
yeah, like the only one that's dangerous was the Heartless because that one was like moving around and stuff. So basically, you indicate that it's hostile. While the 2 static ones are basically they're not hostile, but you don't know what they are until you go up to them and basically say, oh, it's a safe thing, and this is some deck building thing, or something like that.
Yeah.
I suspect like in 13, like since they want to take that whole sci-fi aesthetic, they went all the way, but the whole sci-fi is like completely alien in some ways.
I was just thinking about my favorite type of object, and it's kind of the classic reversal iconography example that is in a lot of different game systems and games, and that's treasure chest mimics. Both in like something like tabletop D&D, but then also in certain games that animate literally the treasure chest coming alive and attacking you. So Torchlight 2 or however other many games have it, because it creates that fun. I think it's a fun feeling of uncertainty, and I just like the idea of a treasure chest, which we think of as supposing to be such a nice thing that's going to help us along the way. It literally is only one physical movement until it becomes a jaw. I mean, and it's kind of an ingenious design, right? It's as you walk around MAGFest and see those treasure chests, I would love it if one of them actually would to animate and to bite our hands. But my other favorite example from Final Fantasy and Final Fantasy IV, but the way it's done is so kind of like heavy-handed, but I love the fact that there's a killer wall. I think the wall is a great example of what should be a kind of idea neutral thing or a net positive, because it's only through domestication of animals and having a consistent environment that humankind has civilization, right? So that should be a good thing, but suddenly not even the walls can be trusted, because the walls get a face and then they start pressing on you and they can crush you. Yeah.
In Ultima 3, it was Exodus, Ultima 3, very late in the game, you come across the ultimate enemy, evil floors and evil grass.
which has the added advantage of being relatively easy to animate in the game system,
I feel
right?
like that's where it came from. It's like the design team just couldn't be asked to make new enemies. So this grass texture and this colored tile are now attacking you and are almost unstoppable.
Right, and well, it's fitting too that it comes in the Ultimate series, which famously is the one game series that came to be about moral alignment and ethics, like explicitly in like, what is it, Quest of the Avatars, the one where you.
That was the one that came after Exodus.
Right, so it's funny that like, I imagine Lord Britain one night is like, what if we made the grass be the thing that kills you, and everyone's like, okay. I'm sure they didn't talk like that. I'm sure they had a more regal sounding medieval. But yeah, there are more things people want to bring up. We have a few more minutes. Or the sound thing too. I'm especially interested in the sound thing. But yeah, sorry.
No, I was thinking, there's a fairly new game called Broken Age. It's kind of like a puzzle adventure. And
Mhm.
it's like, they very deliberately made all the objects as neutral as possible. Because you can play as, you have to play as two separate characters at different points in the game. And like,
What's an example of the type of object in
like
it?
a snake. Like,
Okay.
you walk along a forest path, you see a snake, like, no, that's probably not good. But you interact with it anyway, because you can't die in this game.
Right, right.
And like, you're playing as the girl, it drops down and it's a boa constrictor, starts constricting you. You're stuck until you can get it off you and then you run away, because you can't do anything with it.
Right.
So snake bad. But then the boy character comes along and the snake drops down on you because you're like, you know what, I have nothing else to interact with right now. Let's get caught by the snake again.
Right.
And you just stand there, it's like, oh, you're a cute snake, aren't you? You're giving me a hug. And you have to stand there and keep going through the dialogue until the snake wears itself out trying to constrict you. And then
Okay.
it drops off. And now the snake is your friend, so snake is good.
I like that a lot. So that's in film. It's kind of what we call the Rashomon effect. For people who've seen Rashomon, which is a film. It's a Kurosawa film where the same story is told from the point of view of three different people. And so in this game, it's the point of view determines the ethical or moral relationship to the object, right? Or the narrative as scripted. But the idea is that like for the boy, the snake becomes something that's good. But I like that because that I think is the best example of kind of what our relationships to things are in the real world anyway, because I may love peanut butter, but you may have a peanut allergy. So to me, peanut butter is like the manna from heaven, and to you, it's the thing that can kill you. So it's all about getting multiple perspectives in on it, right? I think that and to include that, to include a player to have to experience maybe something they don't agree with or that's not natural to them, I think that's also a cool thing. But did anyone have a sound example where like a sound cue comes to be associated? Like I know famously people have as a ringtone like the Windows 3.1 boot up or something. But like is there a type of sound that because of how it's used in video games we come to associate with a positive or a negative? Or in the way that how like in film we have the Wilhelm scream being this like this type of, it was this canned kind of recording from a 50s film that becomes the scream effect when in most action movies where someone is like thrown off a ledge, and it's kind of a joke, but at the same time it connotes a certain type of surprise and whatever. So I feel like that has like that's a sound with a specific meaning. But did people have hands up? Yeah.
It occurs to me that I think the last Legend of Zelda game I've ever played was Link to the Past, and yet still I find myself in moments when I finally figure out this really inscrutable puzzle, and when that eureka moment of clarity comes, I just imagine.
Yeah. Yeah, the do is like if I find $5 in my pocket, that's literally the sound I hear when that happens. But are there other sounds that kind of have that? Yeah.
Final Fantasy VII victory theme.
Okay.
It'd be something.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that actually precedes 7.
Oh, that they keep. Yeah.
Was it 3 was the first one that had that?
I don't know. I remember it definitely from 4 and 6. Those are the first ones I played. But that idea, though, that it's enforced not just for where it comes in the game, but through repetition. Because if you play that game with the sound on and you hear that after every encounter, you've heard that musical cue hundreds of times. So I feel like it really imprints itself. That's another thing that you can. I mean, we may not have time to talk about it, but it's a lot of these conventions and codes come about because of enforcement and repetition. So something doesn't necessarily become an iconographic convention if it's the one example of it that you've ever seen. But if it's something that, because it's encountered so frequently either in one game or in multiple games, it's when it takes on that valence. I also want to point out, given our cloud discussion, I think it's funny that in a lot of platformers, clouds are animated to have smiling faces. To maybe say something like, you don't have to avoid me because I'm just something that like makes the world be a happier place. Are there any closing sentiments people have or questions or whatever? My whole idea basically with this panel was just to be like, hey, next time you play a game, you can think about it in terms of like all these things that you know about the world, not just the specific things you know about video games, kind of come into play when you encounter a game. And that when you walk around like the console room or the arcade room, even if you encounter a game you've never played, my bet is that 75 to 90% of that game will be instantly intelligible to you because you know the conventions from other experiences. And then if you're interested in the history of art, you know, next time you go to an art gallery and you start reading the conventions of a painting, think about the video game equivalents. Because sometimes, like when I'm at the National Gallery, I love to go around and be like, what genre of game would this like pietà scene from 15th century like Holland be part of? You know, like it's kind of a fun thought experiment. But my basic idea with MAGFest panels is I kind of like the thought experiment of a lot of this stuff. So, you know, this may be a weird way to talk about games, but I think it's a fun one, and I think it really enriches the way I don't have as much time to play games as I used to, but when I do, it's kind of fun to cycle through some of these ideas. So,
One thing that I noticed that regarding sound design, one thing that seems ubiquitous and it appears in two forms is menu clicking.
Mm-hmm.
It is either some form of a low beep that alternates with a high beep depending on positive and negative connotations, enter menu, leave menu, or it's just a click that is nondescript and doesn't really have either of those.
It's a confirmation sound to confirm that the button press went through.
Yeah.
But also I think it's an accessibility thing. So increasingly games are designed around the fact that, you know, we're all differently abled. Some people hear better than others, some people see better. And so it's a way to confirm, like, yeah, which, you know, and I think certain types of games and certain platforms maybe are better at doing that than others. But I think, yeah, so it has all those functions. But I think you're also right to say that maybe sometimes like a menu in a shop might have a money sound. Whereas a menu in your, if you're looking through your equipment bag, it may have the sound of a leather satchel or something. So they can contextualize it too. But the function of it, we are like, okay, the button press works, or oh, the menu works. But yeah, now you got me thinking. Next time I play a game with a menu, I'm just going to be like fixating on that, like.
Wondering whether or not this menu.
Right,
sound
it's like the
works.
noise of like a leaky faucet, and you just hear it constantly, and you're like, I can't get it out of my head.
I
Yeah.
worked for a large telecommunications company, and we moved into some big offices, and the telephone that they have, when you press the buttons, did not beep. So we all go in there, and everyone's complaining about the phones. The phones are broken, they're not working well, the phones were the lowest bidder.
Mhm.
And several hundreds of thousands of American dollars were spent replacing all the phones because there wasn't that audible response that when I hit the button, that I'd actually hit the button. So that's actually kind of key.
But that's fascinating, though, how everyone would be like, they would have the same intuitive response that this can't possibly be working because, yeah. Well, it's
And also the fact that it was a telecommunications company.
right, yeah. Well, so somewhere you can take solace though in the fact that someplace somewhere in the world right now is somebody who's like, I thought it was a good idea. I didn't think we needed the noise. Who's like alone in a house, like sad or something. That's a Schadenfreude moment. Okay. Well, thanks a lot for coming. I'll see you all around MAGFest.